Elias Mercer stood in front of a fogged bathroom mirror while dawn pressed its pale light against the window. The house was quiet in that specific way it gets before a big day. No TV, no footsteps, just the soft hum of a refrigerator and the faint tick of a clock that suddenly sounded too loud. He rolled his shoulders once like he used to before stepping outside in uniform and studied his reflection. 40-something now. A carpenter's hands. A veteran's posture. Straight, disciplined, as if the world still needed him to stay ready. His hair was clipped close. His jaw looked steadier than he felt. On the counter sat a small paper cup of water, 2 plain pills, and a folded hospital packet with his name printed in bold. Next to it, almost out of place, was a worn sketchbook with a rubber band around it. The cover was scuffed. The corners were soft from years of being carried, set down, picked up again. Elias smiled at himself, not the nervous kind of smile, not the "I'm fine" smile people force on the outside of fear. It was something gentler, like gratitude that finally had words. He leaned closer to the mirror and whispered, mostly to his own reflection, mostly to whatever part of him still remembered the dark days. "I'm about to give away a piece of my body to someone I've never met," he said, "and it's the best decision I've ever made." He didn't say it like a performance. He said it like a vow. From the hallway came the muffled sound of a floorboard creaking. A moment later, a teenage boy's silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall and slightly slouched, hair messy from sleep. Leo, 15 now, but still carrying that quiet, careful way of moving through a room, like every object had a volume only he could hear. Leo's eyes landed on Elias, then on the hospital packet, then on the sketchbook. "You're awake early," Leo said, voice soft. Elias turned, keeping the smile. "Couldn't sleep." Leo stepped in, barefoot, rubbing his palms together the way he did when thoughts crowded too close. Elias watched him with the patience of someone who had learned that love sometimes meant waiting without pushing. "You don't have to do it," Leo said, staring at the counter, not at his dad. "You could change your mind." Elias took a breath and let it out slow. "I could," he admitted, "but I won't." Leo finally looked up. In his eyes was a question bigger than fear, bigger than surgery. The question was, why would anyone do something like that? Elias reached past the hospital packet and lifted the sketchbook, holding it with both hands as if it were fragile. He loosened the rubber band and opened it to a page filled with old drawings. Bright, uneven shapes, a sun with too many rays, a field of tall flowers. The colors were faded, but the feeling inside them hadn't changed. "This is why," Elias said. Leo's expression shifted. Recognition, not of the art itself, but of what it meant, of where it came from, of the hands that once held crayons like they were lifelines. Elias closed the sketchbook and set it back down, gently. "There are people who show up for you when you can't show up for yourself," he said, "and sometimes the only way to live with that kind of gift is to pass it forward." Leo swallowed. "But you said you don't even know who it is." "I don't," Elias answered. "That's part of it." He glanced again at his reflection, at the man he was now, and saw, like a shadow behind him, the man he used to be. The veteran coming home with too much noise in his head, the father trying to keep a roof over them, the husband trying to pretend he wasn't breaking. But the mirror didn't hold the past for long. The present was right here, bright and steady. In the kitchen, a kettle clicked off. Elias's wife, Nina, moved quietly, letting them have this moment without interrupting it. She had learned, too, that courage didn't always look loud. Elias stepped closer to Leo and rested a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not scared," he said, and he meant it. "Not because it's easy, because it's right." Leo's breathing hitched, then leveled. He nodded once, small, careful, but real. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Elias squeezed his shoulder. "When I come back," he said, "I want you to bring that sketchbook to the hospital." Leo blinked. "Why?" Elias looked at the worn cover like it held a map only he could read. "Because somewhere," he said, "a debt is about to be repaid." Outside, the sky was turning from dark to soft gray. Elias picked up his hospital packet, tucked it under his arm, and stood there for a moment like a man pausing at the edge of something sacred. Then he walked toward the door, smiling, not because he didn't understand what was ahead, but because he did. The hospital lobby smelled like coffee and floor polish, bright with morning light that bounced off glass and clean white walls. Elias moved through it with a calm that surprised even him. He'd walked into harder places wearing heavier things. Today, he carried only a folder and a decision. At the registration desk, a volunteer in a blue vest glanced at his chart, then smiled the warm, practiced smile of someone who had seen nerves up close for years. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer. They're expecting you." Elias nodded, gripping the folder a little tighter. Nina walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his elbow like a quiet reminder. "I'm here." Leo followed a step behind, sketchbook tucked under his arm as if it were an important document. In a small consultation room, the transplant coordinator introduced herself, Marisol, with kind eyes and a voice that never rushed. A physician came in next, followed by a hospital lawyer whose presence made the room feel suddenly official, like Elias had stepped into a contract with life itself. They reviewed the consent forms, the questions, the confirmations. They didn't talk in dramatic tones. They spoke plainly, carefully, the way professionals do when they respect the weight of what's being offered. Marisol slid a document across the table. "This is the authorization for an altruistic kidney donation," she said gently. "You're not related to the recipient. You're choosing to donate without expecting anything in return." Elias stared at the words as if they were a mirror too, one more reflection of who he wanted to be. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I need to ask this clearly. You understand you can withdraw at any time, even today. No one will be told you changed your mind, and if you proceed, you may never know who the recipient is." Marisol added, softer. "Some donors want to know, some don't. Both choices are respected." Elias's pen hovered above the signature line. For a moment, his mind drifted, not to the procedure, not to fear, but to a memory that had never stopped visiting him in quiet hours. A week when the pantry had been almost empty. A night when he'd sat on the edge of the couch, staring at a final notice taped to the front door. Leo at 7 years old, small and silent, drawing sunflowers with fierce concentration because paper was one of the few places the world didn't hurt him. And then, someone had shown up. Not with a spotlight, not with a speech, with small, steady acts that made the world feel survivable again. The lawyer watched Elias carefully. "So," he asked, "are you sure you don't want to know who the recipient is?" Elias set the pen down and looked up. His voice didn't shake. "No," he said, "I don't want to know." Nina's eyes widened a fraction, surprised, maybe not by his choice, but by how certain he sounded. The lawyer blinked. "May I ask why?" Elias breathed in, and when he spoke, it was as if he were speaking to more than the people in the room, like he was speaking to the past version of himself who once believed kindness was an accident. "Because I'm not doing this to collect a name," he said. "I'm doing this to repay something I can't forget." Marisol's expression softened. "A debt," Elias nodded once. "A debt," he repeated. "One I didn't even realize I was carrying until I got older." Leo shifted in his chair, with eyes flicking to the sketchbook in his lap. Nina reached over and squeezed his hand. The lawyer cleared his throat, returning to procedure. "Understood. Then you'll sign here, confirming anonymity." Elias picked up the pen again. The point touched paper. His signature flowed across the line, steady, deliberate, like the final nail in a beam that would hold. When he finished, Marisol took the form as if it were something sacred. "Thank you," she said, voice low. "You're doing a remarkable thing." Elias didn't correct her, but inside he thought, remarkable is what someone did for us when no one was watching. He stood, feeling the air in the room shift. The moment was official now, the mystery sealed. As they walked out into the hallway, Nina leaned close enough for only him to hear. "You really don't want to know?" Elias kept his eyes forward. "If I know," he said, "it becomes a story about them and me." He glanced at Leo, at the sketchbook hugged to his chest like a heartbeat. "If I don't," Elias finished, "it stays what it's supposed to be. A gift, and somewhere beyond those walls, a life was waiting for it. Unnamed, unseen, but real." 15 years earlier, Elias Mercer didn't wake up to quiet. He woke up to a ceiling fan that clicked on every third spin and a mind that never truly turned off. Morning light would creep through the blinds, but it didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like interrogation, another day asking him to pretend he wasn't exhausted, that he wasn't still overseas in the places he refused to describe. He'd come home with medals in a shoebox and a discharge packet full of polite language. Transition, they called it, like a man could simply step from one life into another without bringing the weight with him. Back then, Elias's hands were still strong, but his confidence was thin. He'd applied to jobs that promised stability, warehouse work, maintenance, construction crews. He showed up early. He shook hands. He made eye contact like he'd been taught. And yet, the moment a supervisor asked, "So how have you been since you got back?" something in Elias would tighten. His words would stumble. His jaw would lock. Sometimes he'd leave before the interview ended. Other times he'd get hired and last a week before the noise, the sudden shouts, the pressure, the bright lights of a busy job site turned his chest into a cage. He'd go home and sit in his truck in the driveway, forehead against the steering wheel, breathing like he'd run miles. Nina tried to be patient. She was patient, but patience didn't pay rent. They lived in a small house with peeling paint on the porch railing and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. It was the kind of place people drove past without noticing. Elias noticed everything: the neighbor's dog that barked at 2 a.m., the way the front door didn't close unless you lifted it by the handle, the envelope with the red stamp that came more often as months passed. Leo was 7 then. He didn't speak much at school, but at home he spoke in colors. He'd line up crayons in careful order, reds, oranges, yellows, like they were a language he could control. When he was overwhelmed, he'd draw. When he was happy, he'd draw. When he couldn't explain why the world felt too loud, he'd draw anyway. At school, that difference made him a target. Elias didn't find out right away. Leo didn't come home crying. He came home quieter. He began to fold inward like a paper crane trying to disappear. One afternoon, Nina found Leo's lunchbox untouched in his backpack. "You didn't eat?" she asked gently. Leo shrugged, staring at his hands. Elias was the one who asked the wrong question. "Did someone take your lunch?" Leo's eyes darted away. That was answer enough. The next morning, Elias marched into the school office with the kind of controlled anger that had once kept him alive. He stood tall, jaw tight, hands curled into fists inside his jacket pockets. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak to someone," Elias said. "About my son." She pointed him toward the principal's office. He waited and waited, and when the principal finally appeared, the man spoke in rehearsed phrases. "Policies, procedures, we'll look into it." Elias's frustration burned hot and useless. He left feeling smaller than when he'd arrived. That night, he sat on the edge of the couch while Nina washed dishes in silence. The TV was on, but muted. Leo sat on the floor, drawing sunflowers. Tall stems, bright heads, a whole field of them, as if he were building a place where nothing could reach him. Elias watched his son's small hand move across the page and felt something crack open in his chest. He had survived war, but he didn't know how to survive this slow, quiet unraveling of a family that was trying its best and still losing. When the knock came at the door 2 days later, it was late afternoon. Nina opened it. There was no one there, just a paper grocery bag sitting neatly on the welcome mat. Inside were canned goods, bread, peanut butter, and a small note written in careful handwriting. "From the community fund. No need to return." Nina looked down the street, confused. Elias stepped outside, scanning both directions, but the sidewalks were empty. He picked up the bag like it was a strange miracle, and for the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, hope. The next week, another grocery bag appeared. Same time, late afternoon. Same neat placement on the welcome mat, like whoever left it wanted to keep the house's dignity intact. This time, it included fresh apples, a carton of eggs, and a small pack of colored paper. Tucked between the paper and the bread was another note. "Leo has a gift. Please keep encouraging him." Elias reread that line 3 times. Leo had a gift. It was the first time in a long while someone had said something about his son that wasn't framed as a problem. That night, at the kitchen table, Nina spread the groceries out slowly, as if naming each item might make it more real. Leo sat with his elbows tucked close, watching. He didn't touch anything until Elias slid the colored paper across the table toward him. Leo's fingers hovered, then landed on the paper like he was meeting an old friend. "Where did it come from?" Nina asked. Elias shook his head. "Same note, same handwriting, community fund." Nina didn't look convinced. "We don't have a community fund," she whispered. almost like she didn't want to offend the kindness by doubting it. The next morning, Elias drove Leo to school instead of putting him on the bus. He wanted eyes on the building, the students, the adults. He wanted to see who noticed his son and how. Leo walked in with his backpack held high against his chest. Elias followed him to the office, asked for his classroom, and got a direction and a polite smile that didn't understand the urgency behind his questions. When Elias reached the hallway, he heard laughter. Not joyful laughter, sharp laughter. He saw 3 boys near the water fountain. One of them held a sheet of paper, Leo's paper, a drawing, crumpled at the edges. The boy waved it like a flag, reading something out loud to the other 2, while they snickered. Elias's body went cold. The old soldier in him rose up, ready to protect, ready to confront. But before he could step forward, a voice cut clean through the hallway like a bell. Enough. A woman stood between the boys and the water fountain, posture straight, eyes steady. She wasn't tall, but she carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. She held out her hand. "Give it back," she said. The boy hesitated. I said," she repeated, calm as stone, "give it back." He dropped the drawing into her hand, suddenly aware of the consequences he couldn't talk his way out of. The woman turned and walked toward Leo, who stood frozen near his classroom door, staring at the floor as if he wanted to disappear into it. She crouched down, smoothing the paper as best she could. Then she looked Leo in the eyes, like his eyes were worth meeting. "This is beautiful," she said. "Did you make it?" Leo's shoulders lifted in a small, nervous twitch. He nodded once. The woman smiled, warm, genuine. "I'm Miss Miller," she said, "and I want you to know something." Leo blinked. "I see what you see," Ms. Miller continued, "even if other people don't understand it yet." Elias stood back, hidden behind the corner, stunned by the tenderness of the moment. He expected teachers to correct behavior, to file reports, to do the official things. He didn't expect one to kneel in the hallway and speak to his son like he mattered. Ms. Miller walked Leo into the classroom. She didn't rush him. She didn't push his shoulders forward. She moved at Leo's pace, like she understood that safety had a tempo. Later that day, Elias got a call from the school. He assumed it would be the principal again, but it was Ms. Miller. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice gentle, "I wanted to introduce myself properly. Leo is in my art enrichment block twice a week. I've noticed he communicates most clearly through drawing." Elias swallowed. "He does," he said. "I'd like to help him feel safer here." Ms. Miller continued, "And I'd like to partner with you if you're willing." Elias didn't trust easily back then. His life had taught him that hope could be expensive, but something about her tone, steady, respectful, made him answer honestly. "We're willing," he said. We don't know what we're doing." Miss Miller paused as if choosing her words with care. "That's okay," she said. "Sometimes the most important thing is simply not giving up on someone." When the call ended, Elias sat in his truck, hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing. He thought about the grocery bag, the notes, the colored paper, and he realized with a quiet certainty that community fund was just a disguise, because this didn't feel like a program. It felt like a person. The following Friday, Elias came home to find a bright orange sticker slapped across the front door. Not a letter this time. Not a polite warning in an envelope. A sticker, bold, impossible to ignore. The kind of thing meant to shame you into paying faster, like embarrassment could turn into money. Elias stood there for a long moment, keys still in his hand, staring at that orange rectangle as if it had teeth. Inside, Nina was at the kitchen table with bills spread out like a losing hand. She looked up, and Elias didn't need words to understand what she'd been doing. Adding, subtracting, hoping the numbers would change if she stared hard enough. Leo sat on the floor nearby, cross-legged, drawing. His world remained 2 feet off the ground, where paper was flat and predictable. He didn't look up when Elias walked in, but Elias saw the way Leo's pencil slowed. Kids like Leo felt everything, even when they didn't name it. Elias peeled the sticker off the door with his fingernail. It came away in pieces, leaving behind sticky residue like the past refusing to let go. He crumpled the torn sticker in his fist and tried to swallow the helplessness rising in his throat. That night, after Leo went to bed, Elias sat on the back steps with Nina. The air was cold enough to sting. The porch light buzzed faintly. In the distance, a siren wailed and faded like a reminder that other lives were falling apart too. Nina wrapped her cardigan tighter. I called the landlord again, she said. He said Monday is the deadline. After that, he files. Elias nodded, staring into the dark. I'll take whatever work I can get this weekend, he said. Day labor. Anything. Nina didn't argue. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, and Elias felt the weight of her trust, the kind that makes you feel loved and terrified at the same time. I hate this, Nina whispered. I know, Elias said. He didn't tell her that he'd started to think about sleeping in the truck, about giving Nina and Leo the bedroom if they had to live somewhere temporary, about how a man could protect his family and still fail them. Monday morning arrived like a verdict. Elias walked Leo to the bus stop with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, face set, eyes forward. Leo didn't chatter like other kids. He watched the sidewalk cracks, stepping over them in a careful pattern that only he understood. When the bus doors folded open, Leo paused and looked up. Dad? Yeah? Leo's voice was barely above a whisper. Are we okay? Elias forced a smile. We're okay, he said, even though it tasted like a lie he didn't want to teach his son. At home, Nina left for work, and Elias sat at the kitchen table staring at the bills again. He pulled out his phone to call another contractor, another temp agency, another person who might say no. Before he could dial, a knock came at the door. Elias froze. For a split second, his mind went to the worst possibility. The landlord, a deputy, someone with paperwork that would change everything. He opened the door slowly. No one stood there, but an envelope rested on the welcome mat, perfectly centered, like it had been placed with intention. It wasn't stamped. No return address, just his name written in careful handwriting. Elias picked it up, heart thumping, and opened it right there in the doorway. Inside was a cashier's check, $5,000. He blinked hard, certain he had misread it. He looked again, $5,000. Tucked behind the check was a single sheet of paper, a note written with that same neat handwriting he'd seen before. Sometimes help should arrive before pride gets in the way. Please accept this. No questions, no repayment. Elias's hands started to shake, not from fear, but from the shock of being seen, of someone knowing exactly where the breaking point was and stepping in right before the snap. He stumbled backward and sat down on the small bench by the door, the envelope clutched to his chest like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Nina came home at lunch, breathless because Elias had called and could barely form words. When she saw the check, she covered her mouth with both hands. This can't be real, she whispered. It's real, Elias said, voice thick. Nina's eyes filled. Who would do this? Elias stared at the handwriting again, at the quiet firmness of it. He had his suspicions now. One name floated to the surface like a lantern in dark water, Ms. Miller. But he couldn't prove it. He couldn't ask without risking her dignity or the strange sacred purity of the gift. That afternoon, he drove to the school anyway, not to accuse, not to demand answers, but to stand outside the art room door when the bell rang. He watched Miss Miller walk students out with patient smiles, watched her kneel to tie a shoe, watched her hand a shy kid a clean sheet of paper like it was a second chance. When she finally saw Elias, her face didn't change. No guilt, no fear, just that same steady warmth. Mr. Mercer, she said, is Leo doing okay today? Elias swallowed the lump in his throat. The check burned like a secret in his jacket pocket. He's doing better, Elias managed, because of you. Miss Miller held his gaze for a moment, then smiled softly. Good, she said. That's what matters. And just like that, she turned back to her students, as if she hadn't just rescued a family from the edge. Elias stood there watching her, finally understanding something he'd never learned in the army. Some heroes don't wear uniforms. Some carry colored pencils. 15 years later, the house no longer leaned to one side. Elias had fixed the porch railing himself, replaced the mailbox, built a small studio out back where Leo, now tall, quiet, and focused, spent hours painting light the way other people painted walls. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was steady, and for Elias, steady felt like grace. He was sanding a cabinet door when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. Elias wiped his hands on a rag before answering. This is Elias. Mr. Mercer, a woman said, professional but kind. My name is Marisol. I'm calling from the Regional Medical Center. You recently attended a community veterans health seminar? Elias pictured the folding chairs, the coffee in cardboard cups, the flag at the front of the room. He'd gone because the flyer mentioned resources for veterans transitioning into civilian life. Old habits died hard. Yes, he said. I was there. We shared information about living organ donation, Marisol continued. You checked a box requesting more details. Elias remembered. He hadn't overthought it. He just felt pulled. Marisol spoke carefully, the way people do when words matter. There's a woman in our community in urgent need of a kidney transplant. She has no immediate family who can donate. We're reaching out to potential altruistic donors, individuals considering an altruistic kidney donation without prior connection. Elias leaned against his workbench. Sunlight streamed through the open door, catching dust in the air like tiny floating stars. Are you asking me if I'd consider it? He said. I am, Marisol replied. There's no obligation, just a conversation. Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the far wall where one of Leo's early paintings hung, a field of sunflowers, framed and protected now. The colors were brighter than the original, more confident, like the artist had grown into his own vision. I'll come talk, Elias said finally. The evaluation process took weeks. Conversations, tests, long walks where Elias thought about risk and responsibility and what it meant to be needed again. He talked to Nina late at night, their voices low so Leo wouldn't overhear fear dressed up as concern. You've already given so much, Nina said once, fingers laced with his. So have others, Elias replied. He never asked who the woman was. He didn't want her story. He didn't want to measure her worth against his own reasons. He trusted the circle. He trusted that life, somehow, kept accounts better than people did. On the morning he was cleared as a match, Marisol smiled wider than before. You're officially approved, she said. If you proceed, it will be fully anonymous. The recipient will never know your name unless both parties later consent. That's how I want it, Elias said. When word spread quietly through the community, because things like this always find a way, people thanked him. A neighbor dropped off soup. A fellow veteran clapped him on the shoulder and called him a hero. Elias nodded politely, but the word didn't sit right. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He was doing it because once, when he had nothing left to give, someone had given anyway. The night before the surgery, Elias stood alone in the workshop. He picked up a small wooden box he'd been carving in his spare moments. Smooth edges, simple design. Inside, he placed a fresh set of colored pencils, still in their paper sleeve. He didn't know why. He just knew they belonged together. At the hospital, as he changed into a gown and sat on the edge of the dais, felt calm. The same calm he'd felt in the mirror weeks earlier. Marisol checked in once more. Last chance to change your mind, she said gently. Elias smiled. I made this decision a long time ago, he said. I just didn't know it yet. As they wheeled him down the hallway, he closed his eyes, not in fear, but in gratitude. Somewhere nearby, a woman waited for a second chance at life. And Elias, a veteran and a carpenter, was finally able to return a kindness that had once saved everything. When Elias opened his eyes again, the first thing he noticed wasn't pain. It was light. Soft, filtered sunlight poured through a window, turning the hospital curtains into pale gold. The room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of a monitor, calm, regular, like a metronome keeping time for his breath. Nina sat in the chair beside him, her fingers wrapped around a paper cup that had gone cold hours ago. Her eyes were red, but when she saw Elias blink, her whole face changed, relief spilling through like water after a dam breaks. Oh, thank God, she whispered, standing so quickly the chair scraped the floor. Elias tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He swallowed and managed. Hey. Nina laughed through tears, pressing her hand against his shoulder carefully, like she was touching something precious. You did it, she said. You're okay. Elias glanced around, slow and hazy, as if the room needed to come into focus, not just visually, but emotionally. He remembered the hallway, the quiet conversations, the feeling of a choice settling into place. Marisol appeared not long after, clipboard in hand, smiled gentle. Welcome back, she said. Elias tried to sit up a little. Nina helped him, moving with the patient grace of someone who had been holding her breath for months. How's the recipient? Elias asked, voice rough. Marisol's expression stayed warm, but professional. I can tell you this, she said. The transplant was successful. She's stable, and the team is very pleased. Elias nodded, satisfied with that. He didn't ask for more. He didn't want details that weren't his to know. Marisol placed a hand lightly on the bed rail. You'll be resting today, she said. Tomorrow we'll have you up and moving a bit, slowly. Elias exhaled, eyes drifting to the window again. Okay, he murmured. The day passed in gentle fragments. Nurses checking in, Nina reading him a few messages from friends, Leo texting short updates that sounded like him. I'm okay. Love you. I drew something. By the next afternoon, Elias sat in a wheelchair in the hallway, wrapped in a plain blanket. Nina walked beside him, one hand on the chair handle, the other holding his phone. Elias's body felt like it had been through something heavy, but his spirit felt strangely light, like he'd been carrying a weight for years without realizing it. And now it had finally shifted. They moved slowly down the corridor, passing doors with small placards and quiet signs about visitor hours. Nurses glided by in sneakers. Somewhere, someone laughed softly, a sound that reminded Elias life was still happening all around them. At the end of the hall, there was a small waiting nook with a bulletin board full of cards and drawings from children, crayon hearts, stick figure families, bright suns in corners. Elias stared at those drawings as they passed, and something in him softened. He thought about Leo at 7. He thought about the sunflower fields Leo had drawn when the world felt unsafe. He thought about Ms. Miller kneeling in a hallway, smoothing out crumpled paper like it deserved respect. A nurse approached, smiling. Mr. Mercer? She asked. Yes, Elias replied. I'm Abby, she said. I'm just going to wheel you a bit farther, okay? Your wife can walk with us. Nina nodded, grateful for the help. Abby guided the chair gently around a corner Elias hadn't seen before. The corridor was quieter here, lined with windows and potted plants that tried their best to make the hospital feel human. As they rolled past one room, Elias's gaze drifted, idle, unfocused, until it caught on something hanging on the wall just inside the doorway. A framed painting. Not hospital art. Not a generic landscape print. This was different. Elias's breath caught. Wait, he said softly, almost involuntarily. Abby slowed. Everything okay? Elias leaned forward slightly, heart thumping with a sudden, impossible familiarity. The painting was a field of sunflowers under a wide sky, bright heads turned toward light, stems reaching upward like hope with roots. The brushwork wasn't perfect, but it carried something unmistakable, a child's sincerity, a child's way of telling the truth without words. Elias stared, his mind reaching back through time like a hand searching for something it had lost. Nina followed his gaze. Elias, she whispered. What is it? Elias couldn't answer right away. His throat tightened. Because he knew that painting. He had seen it before, not in a frame, but on cheap paper, drawn with crayons and colored pencils on their kitchen floor. Leo's sunflowers. The nurse's voice faded into the background as Elias's world narrowed to that single framed piece. Abby glanced into the room, then back at him. Oh, she said quietly. That belongs to the patient in there. It was brought in to make her feel more at home. Elias's hands curled around the blanket. His mind raced. How could Leo's painting be here? How could something from their darkest year end up on a hospital wall now, 15 years later? Nina's eyes searched his face. Is that Leo's? Elias swallowed hard, and for the first time since the surgery, his calm cracked. I think it is, he whispered. Abby looked confused. You know the painting? Elias didn't answer her. He couldn't, because in that moment, the hospital hallway didn't feel like a hallway anymore. It felt like a doorway, one that was about to open onto a truth he had never expected to find. And he had only stumbled upon it by accident, just by looking up. Elias asked Abby to stop the wheelchair just outside the doorway, not crossing any threshold, not stepping into a place that wasn't his. The room was partially open, the curtain pulled back enough to reveal the wall where the painting hung. Up close, it was undeniable. The sunflowers weren't just sunflowers. They were Leo's sunflowers, the same bold yellow circles with slightly uneven petals, the same heavy green strokes along the stems, the same oversized sun tucked in the corner like a promise. It had been years, but Elias had held that image in his memory the way some people held prayers. Nina leaned forward, eyes wide. How would this be here? She whispered. Elias didn't know. His mind moved carefully, like a man walking across thin ice. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. He didn't want to violate anyone's privacy or his own intention to remain anonymous. But the coincidence felt too precise to be random. There was one detail that could answer everything without asking a single forbidden question. The back, Elias murmured. Nina blinked. What? The back of the frame, Elias said, voice thin. Leo used to write on the back when he was proud. He'd sign things, sometimes for himself, sometimes for someone else. Abby hesitated. I can't let you go in there, she said gently, misunderstanding his urgency. That's another patient's room. Elias turned his head toward her, and his expression softened, respectful. I'm not trying to go in, he said. I need to see something. Is there any way you could check the back of the frame for me? Without taking it down, maybe just a quick look? Abby studied him. Nurses had a radar for drama, but Elias didn't look dramatic. He looked shaken in a way that felt quiet and sincere. She glanced into the room, then back at Elias. Let me see if the patient is awake, she said, and if it's okay. Abby stepped inside carefully, her voice lowered. Elias couldn't hear the words, only the gentle cadence of them. Nina placed a hand on Elias's forearm, grounding him. Her fingers trembled. A moment later, Abby returned to the doorway. She's resting, Abby said softly. But I can check the back of the frame. I won't disturb her. Elias nodded, his heart pounding so hard he felt it in his throat. Abby stepped in, moved quietly to the wall, and lifted the bottom edge of the frame just enough to angle it forward. She leaned closer, reading something on the back. Her face changed. Not shock like a TV twist. Something more human. Recognition of meaning she hadn't expected to find. There's writing, Abby whispered, turning back toward Elias. Elias's breath hitched. What does it say? Abby swallowed, eyes flicking to Nina, then back to Elias. It says, to Ms. Miller, thank you for believing in me. The hallway seemed to tilt. Elias gripped the armrest, knuckles whitening under the blanket. Ms. Miller. Nina's mouth fell open, and for a second she looked like she couldn't inhale. No, she whispered. No, it can't be. Elias stared past Abby into the room. He couldn't see much, just the edge of a bed, a side table with flowers, a woman's hand resting on a blanket. The hand looked thinner than he remembered, but hands always carried the same story. Years of work, years of giving. Abby stepped out again, lowering her voice further. You know her? She asked, trying to make sense of the emotions standing in the hallway. Elias's eyes burned. She saved my family, he whispered, 15 years ago. Nina covered her mouth, tears spilling over now without permission. She was the one, Nina said, voice breaking. The groceries, the check, the notes. Elias nodded slowly, like his body was catching up to his mind. She was the community fund, he said. She was the reason Leo kept drawing. She was the reason we stayed in that house. Abby's eyes softened. Mr. Mercer, she said, I don't know the details, but if this is who you think it is. Elias's voice came out barely audible. Then the person I donated to is her. The thought didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It felt like the universe taking a quiet step back and letting the circle reveal itself. Elias's shoulders sagged, not from weakness, but from the weight of gratitude finally landing somewhere it could breathe. He looked toward the room again, and a choice rose in him, an instinct to step inside, to tell her, to hold that moment in his hands like proof that kindness mattered. But he didn't move, because Miss Miller's kindness had always been quiet. It had never demanded applause. It had slipped groceries onto a welcome mat and walked away. So Elias stayed where he was, in the hallway, honoring the same kind of humility. Nina leaned close, tears on her cheeks. What are you going to do? She asked. Elias's gaze lowered to the blanket over his lap, then lifted back to the painting, now shining like a lighthouse on that wall. I'm going to repay her, he said, voice steadying. The way she did it. And for the first time since he'd signed the altruistic kidney donation paperwork, Elias understood exactly why his heart had been so certain. He hadn't been giving to a stranger. He had been giving to a story that had once given him back his life. Elias didn't go into the room. That choice wasn't about fear. It was about respect, the kind Miss Miller had taught him without ever saying the lesson out loud. Real kindness didn't step into someone's space demanding gratitude. It left room for dignity. It left room for breath. He asked Abby, the nurse, if she could help him with something small. Abby glanced toward the room again, then back at Elias. What do you need? Elias swallowed, voice low. A delivery, he said. Not a conversation. Just a message. Nina looked at him, tears still clinging to her lashes. She already understood. Elias gestured toward his wife. Nina has something in her bag, he said. Nina unzipped her tote with shaking hands and pulled out the wooden box Elias had carved. It was simple. Smooth pine, corners rounded, the lid fitting perfectly. No fancy stain, no plaque, just careful craftsmanship, the way Elias built things when he wanted them to last. Inside were colored pencils, new, bright, untouched, and a small stack of clean sketch paper. Abby's expression softened the moment she saw them. This is for her? Elias nodded. And this. He took out a folded note, written in his own hand. The letters were blocky, carpenter handwriting, the kind that measured twice before committing. Abby didn't read it. She held it gently, as if it were fragile. What do you want me to say? She asked. Elias shook his head. You don't have to say anything, he replied. Just put it where she'll find it. Abby hesitated. The patient might ask who it's from. Elias's jaw tightened for a moment, then released. If she asks, he said, tell her it's from someone who remembers. Abby nodded slowly, understanding more than she could legally confirm. Okay, she said. I can do that. She stepped inside the room with the box cradled in both arms. Elias watched from the hallway, heart pounding in a way it hadn't even during the surgery. This was a different kind of courage, the kind that didn't come with instructions. Nina took Elias's hand, squeezing. She'll know, Nina whispered. Elias stared at the doorframe, at the sliver of the room beyond, and nodded once. She'll know, he echoed. Minutes passed like hours. Abby returned quietly, the door clicking soft behind her. It's done, she said, voice hushed. I placed it on the table by the window. Elias exhaled, the breath trembling on the way out. Abby looked at him a long moment. Mr. Mercer, she said carefully, I don't know what you believe, but I've worked here a long time. I don't see things like this often. Elias's eyes glistened. Neither do I, he admitted. Abby glanced down the hall, making sure no one was watching too closely, then leaned in slightly. She has a teacher appreciation card on her bulletin board, Abby whispered. Dozens. Parents, former students, little notes. She kept them. Elias's throat tightened again. Of course she did. A person who gave like that didn't do it because she was empty. She did it because she stored love, carefully, from everywhere she could find it. Back in the recovery room later that evening, Leo arrived with Nina. He moved slowly, taking in the hospital room with wide eyes. Hospitals had too many sounds, too many lights, too many unknowns. But he came anyway. For his dad, he carried his sketchbook like a shield. Elias smiled when he saw him. Hey, buddy. Leo sat in the chair, gaze flicking between Elias's face and the band on his wrist and the way the blanket rose and fell with his breathing. You look tired, Leo said. I am, Elias admitted, but I'm okay. Leo nodded once, then opened his sketchbook. He flipped to a new drawing. Sunflowers again, but different this time. Stronger lines, a wider sky. And in the center, 2 hands holding the same pencil. Elias stared, voice catching. That's beautiful. Leo tapped the page lightly. It's a circle, he said, searching for the right word. Like when something goes away and then it comes back. Elias's eyes filled. He reached out and gently touched the edge of the paper, careful not to smudge anything. Yes, Elias whispered. Exactly like that. Leo hesitated, then asked the question he'd been holding. Who did you help? Elias looked at his son for a long moment. He could have said, I don't know. That would have been true. But now there was a different truth too, one that didn't break privacy because it wasn't coming from a chart or a file. It was coming from a painting. It was someone who helped us first, Elias said softly. Leo's brow furrowed. Someone from before? Elias nodded. From when you were 7, he said. Someone who saw your sunflowers and understood them. Leo's eyes widened, and in that widening was a quiet recognition, not of a name, but of the feeling. Ms. Miller? Leo whispered. Elias didn't answer with words. He just squeezed Leo's hand. And Leo, for the first time, let his shoulders drop like a weight had finally been set down. Somewhere down the hall, a woman rested beneath the glow of a framed field of sunflowers, unaware that the kindness she had once poured into a struggling family had found its way back to her, not with noise, with gratitude, with color, with a circle completed. A week later, the morning air felt different. Not because everything had magically changed, but because Elias had. He moved slower now, more careful, like a man learning a new rhythm. The world still had sharp edges, traffic, bills, deadlines, but something in him had softened, like a clenched fist finally opening. At home, the workshop smelled of sawdust and fresh-cut pine. Leo sat at the long table with a canvas propped up on an easel. Nina brewed tea, the kettle whistling softly, the kind of sound that now meant comfort instead of urgency. Elias lowered himself into a chair and watched his son paint. Leo's brush moved with patience. No wasted strokes, no frantic correction. He painted like he trusted the outcome. And Elias realized that trust was the real miracle Miss Miller had given them all those years ago. Not groceries, not money, trust. That afternoon, Marisol called to check on Elias's recovery. Her voice was warm and professional, the same as always. "You're healing well," she said, "and I can share something general. Your recipient is also improving steadily." Elias closed his eyes, letting the relief settle in his chest like a slow sunrise. "I'm glad," he said. "That's all I needed." There was a pause. Then Marisol spoke carefully. "Sometimes," she said, "recipients choose to send an anonymous note through the hospital. Would you want to receive one if it happens?" Elias hesitated. He remembered the envelope on the welcome mat, the handwriting, the way kindness could be both anonymous and intimate. "Yes," he said. "If she writes, I'd like to read it." 2 days later, a plain envelope arrived in the mail with the hospital's return address. Nina brought it in like it was something holy. Elias sat at the kitchen table while Leo hovered nearby, pretending not to watch but watching anyway. Elias opened the envelope and unfolded a single page. The handwriting was familiar, neat, careful, like someone who believed words should be gentle. He read silently at first, then his lips began to move. "To the person who gave me a second chance. I don't know your name, and I won't ask. I only want you to know that I've spent my life teaching children to find color in hard seasons. And lately, I had begun to wonder if my own season was ending. Then someone I've never met chose to help me. I don't have big words for this. Only gratitude. Today, I sat by the window with a small wooden box on my table. Inside were colored pencils and paper. I held them the way you hold something you thought you'd lost forever. I don't know why, but it felt like a message. It felt like the world saying, kindness returns." Elias stopped reading. His eyes blurred. Nina pressed a hand to her chest, breathing shakily. Leo stepped closer, quietly, as if he didn't want to startle the moment. Elias looked down at the final line on the page. There was one more sentence. "Wherever you are, I hope you know that your gift will not end with me. I will pass it on." Elias set the paper down, his hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the force of the circle closing so perfectly it hurt. That weekend, Nina drove them to a small park near the school district office. Ms. Miller had been granted a slow return schedule, light duty, limited hours. They weren't going there to reveal names, to burst through boundaries, to demand a reunion that belonged to no one. They went for something quieter. Under an oak tree, the district had set up a teacher appreciation community board. Families could pin notes, drawings, and thank you cards for educators who had made a difference. It was a simple tradition, the kind that didn't make headlines, but made hearts feel less alone. Leo carried a new painting, wrapped carefully in brown paper. Elias helped him walk up to the board. The painting was another sunflower field, but this time the sun sat higher, the sky wider, and in the corner, written in small letters, were words Leo had chosen himself, "For the teacher who saw my world." Leo pinned it to the board and stepped back, blinking fast. Elias put an arm around his son's shoulders. Nina stood on the other side, hand resting on Leo's back. They didn't look for Miss Miller. They didn't need to. Because gratitude didn't require a stage. It required intention. As they walked back to the car, Elias glanced at the board one last time, hundreds of notes fluttering in the breeze like a chorus of quiet thanks. He thought about the mirror, the paperwork, the anonymous choice called an altruistic kidney donation. He thought about a grocery bag on a welcome mat and a teacher who never asked for credit. And he understood the message beneath it all. Kindness is a circle, and it always finds its way home. So if this story moved you, even a little, don't let it stop here. Send a note to a teacher who once believed in you. Help someone quietly. Give what you can, where you are. because the smallest act of goodness, offered with a sincere heart, might be the beginning of someone else's second chance. This story is not really about a surgery or even about an altruistic kidney donation. It's about something quieter and far more powerful. It's about how kindness, when given without witnesses, has a memory. It settles into people, it waits, and when the time is right, it finds its way back. Ms. Miller never knew if the groceries mattered. She never knew if the check saved a home. She never knew if her belief in a quiet, misunderstood child changed the course of a life. But it did, and years later, that same kindness returned, not as applause, not as recognition, but as life itself. This story reminds us that gratitude doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it comes decades later. Sometimes it comes from a place we never expected. And sometimes it comes back to us not with words, but with action. Who believed in you when you were at your lowest? Who showed up quietly, without asking for credit? And if you had the chance today, how would you pass that kindness forward? Maybe it's a message you never sent. Maybe it's help you can offer quietly. Maybe it's choosing compassion when the world tells you to harden instead. We invite you to share your story in the comments. A teacher who changed your life, a stranger who helped you when no one else did, or a moment when kindness came full circle for you.